Hello, hello, hello. Gonna continue reading The Challenge to Liberty, 1934 book by Mr. Herbert Hoover. This part picks up on page 55 is where we're at, which is on socialism. Socialism has many definitions. One authoritative statement of it is as follows. The chief principles of socialism may perhaps be reduced to these. Number one, the abolition of the rights of private ownership and the means of production, natural resource capital, with retention of private property and articles of personal use. This implies state ownership of the means of production. Number two, the administration of the means of production collectively by the state through a democratic political organization. And number three, the abolition of the wage system as it is at present constituted, and the substitution for hours of another scheme for the apportionment of income. This is Herbert Hoover, The Challenge to Liberty, 1934. Says the long-time slogan of the British socialist was, quote, government ownership and operation of all the agencies of production, distribution, and exchange. Others, less frank groups parading the cloak of liberalism, take variously milder positions advocating government ownership and operation of less extensive economic areas. And by the moderation of their demands, some of them honestly do not believe themselves to be and would even deny they are socialists, except communists. Few of the modern socialists advocate violence, but seek to obtain their goal by working through the established agencies of government, thus gradually pushing the nation into their path inch by inch. They realize that any step taken by government into ownership and operation of no matter how small a segment of an industry will be followed rapidly by other steps. For they know that through the insatiable appetite of bureaucracy to enlarge itself, the ability of government to disorganize the adequate service, there will grow apparent justification for the socialist system. They anticipate also that the owners of private enterprise, trying to compete with such tyranny in government, in parentheses, for which the taxpayer stands the losses, close parentheses, will often enough in despair become willing or even anxious to join in advocating government purchase to protect their savings. This is probably true. The greatest chance of socialism is not the agitation of immature academic minds, nor the violent communist. It is that even a moderate adoption of government operation. Just doing a little reading on the Challenge to Liberty, and this is the area of alternative philosophies. It says true American liberalism utterly denies the whole creed of socialism. The disguised or open objective of socialism is equality in income, wages, or economic rewards. The tenet of equality in true liberalism is a tenet of equality in birth, equality before the law, and equality of opportunity, as distinguished from equality of reward for services. True liberalism insists that to equalize rewards and possession of material things robs the individual of free imagination, inventiveness, risk, adventure, individual attainment, development of personality, and independence from a monotony that would sentence the soul to imprisonment. It denies the socialist contention that men will be more free when compelled to work under and to work for only one employer, the government. Boo, boo. Thumbs down, thumbs down. It is important here to repeat that liberty denies that the materials of life adequate to meet the needs of society can be obtained without reward proportionate to ability and service. It rejects the theory that men will strive to the utmost and will deny themselves from enjoying immediately the whole of the daily income unless they have confidence in the protection of their honesty, honestly acquired savings, and thus may protect themselves and their children by their own means and possessions against a rainy day. It holds that ample leadership and improvement cannot be found except by competition, that it cannot be found under the bushel of governmental bureaucracy. It denies that politicians can manage the economic system as well as the people who have risen in it and whose hopes and security of living rest in advancing it. The American system can point not only to theory but to practice. We have already seen our government try to operate railroads and ships. We know the results. Didn't go well. The socialists are fond of eulogizing the post office as a great example of successful socialism. That the government should control the mails for reasons of confidence is not denied, but that private enterprise could collect and deliver the mail for three-quarters of the present cost is obvious to anyone competent to study the subject. One thing is a certainty that if all industry, through the inescapable play of political and bureaucratic action, were reduced to the efficiency of the post office, we should fail within a few years to produce sufficient to feed, clothe, and care for our people. Yeah. These arguments are limited to the workability and utility of the socialist system. There's a much larger aspect. The socialists claim they would maintain the democratic institutions and all other freedoms except economic freedom. Democratic institutions would not last long. Producing economic equality by regimenting of the whole population into government employees scarcely assures the election. Democratic institutions was a large part of the cause of the collapse of these institutions in Italy, Germany, Austria, Poland, and in other places, with the inevitable leap of dictatorship to their place. And I may add a word to that group of people in and out of government who are playing with socialist fire without expecting it really to burn. The penetration of socialist methods, even to a partial degree, will demoralize the economic system, the legislative bodies, and in fact, the whole system of ordered liberty. No people will for long permit demoralization. In the United States, the reaction from such chaos will not be more socialism, but will be towards fascism. The inevitability is not only establishable from internal study or of the forces in the United States, but it has been the invariable turn in foreign countries where there is a considerable economic middle class. It is proportionately larger in the United States than in any other country in the world. The path of socialism leads straight to its own downfall together with the pillars of liberty. Amen. Socialism leads straight to its own downfall together with the pillars of liberty. Yes, it does. Communism position of socialism all at once by violence. And Bolshevism is the insistence that the proletariat shall administer such imposition. It is difficult to find positive definitions of communism among its friends. They are mostly involved in polemics against other systems. A few partial definitions are: the basis of communist society must be, there you go, Brother P. Tracy, got some facts over here. 1934, the Challenge to Liberty by Herbert Hoover. It says the basis of communist society must be the social ownership of the means of production and exchange. Communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against extant social and political conditions. Bolshevism is the revolutionary Marxist movement in the Russian and the international labor movement. Fortunately or unfortunately for the world, we are able to observe communism, that is, socialism in its full form, at work in a whole nation. With 17 years of record in Russia, we are no longer dependent upon combating a theory of utopia. We can see it in practice. One of the favorite phrases and constant preoccupations of communism is, quote, economic planning, end quote. As to the results of this practical socialism in action, I may well quote an able social observer who states his prior open-mindedness toward this experiment. Surely the time has come for the intellectuals, the liberals, and the radicals of the world to speak out about this new slavery, to call it clearly and bluntly what it is, for it can no longer be. It has oppressed with unsurpassed barbarity men and women guilty of no other crime than the prosperity attendant, merciless penalties, and a million spies. It has deported or shot hundreds of thousands of men and women solely for political heresy and nonconformance. ... It has subjected to censorship every drama and every book, even every opera. It has prostituted the press, the radio, and the stage. ... It has suppressed all freedom of speech or assembly, and in effect has raised 1,000 obstacles against the freedom of worship and belief. ... Slavery, barbarism, and desolation, these fundamentally, despite 1,000 minor virtues, is what Russia is today. And this was in 1934. I feel you. And it's probably very interesting. Here we see applied socialism in a country larger and even more varied in its natural resources than the United States, where by extinguishing all self-interest and all freedom, it has not been able to secure enough production to feed its people. The standard of living to the whole population, except the officials and soldiers, is much lower than that of our people who are today on relief. Liberty is dead. Whatever the maladjustments in the American system may be, it has been the very mother of plenty in production. It seems, therefore, inadvisable to adopt systems which, although they promise equality in distribution, fail to produce the commodities to distribute. But the other evils of communism are far greater than the material ones. Freedom of men's minds and souls is more precious to the future of humanity than even the jam on their bread, which neither socialism nor communism will produce. Fascism. This theory rose to power under Premier Mussolini in the economic depression of 1922, when the Italian state was not only suffering from the post-war worldwide economic dislocation, but its dislocation was being greatly increased by socialist and communist activities. Immediately upon Signor Mussolini's appointment as premier, he requested Parliament to, quote unquote, vote him full of powers, end quote, stating, quote, whoever stands against the government will be punished, ... The nation is waiting. We will not give it words, but deeds, end quote. The powers were voted. Parliament has met periodically since, but has confined itself to confirming executive orders and declares and has now voted its own final dissolution with cheers. What's up, brother? Speaking some facts in this book. This book's putting out some facts. It's called The Challenge to Liberty, written 1934. In order that there can be no doubt as to its antithesis to liberalism, we may well accept Premier Mussolini's definition of fascism. There we go. A little Mussolini. ... Fascism combats the whole complex of democratic ideology and repudiates it. Fascism denies that the majority, by the simple fact that it is a majority. Let me do that again. It says fascism combats the whole complex of democratic ideology and repudiates it. Fascism denies that the majority, by the simple fact that it is a majority, can direct human society. It denies that numbers alone can govern by means of periodical consultation. Fascism denies in democracy the absurd, conventional untruth of political equality and the myth of, quote unquote, happiness and indefinite progress. ... Fascism has taken up an attitude of economics. Let it be pointed out that all political hopes of the present day are anti-liberal. Granted that the 19th century was the century of socialism, of liberalism, and of democracy, ... It may rather be expected that this will be a century of authority, a century on the left, a century of fascism. For if the 19th century was a century of individualism, in parentheses, liberalism always signifying individualism, close parentheses, it may be expected that this will be the century of collectivism, and hence the century of the state. The fascist state is an embodied will to power and government. The Roman tradition is here an ideal of force and action. ... This fact explains many aspects of the practical working of the regime, the character of many forces in the state, and the necessarily severe measures that must be taken against those who would oppose this spontaneous and inevitable movement of Italy in the 20th century, and would oppose it by recalling the outworn ideology of the 19th century. Repudiated wheresoever there has been the courage to undertake great experiments of social and political transformation. If every age has its own characteristic doctrine, there are 1,000 signs that point to fascism as the characteristic doctrine of our time. Hello, Michelle or Dawn. Greetings, everybody. Greetings. That was Mussolini's definition of fascism. The political, and that was the end of that. Now it says the political organization of Italy today is a complete dictatorship supported by one political party to the forcible exclusion of all others. In respect to the Constitution, Premier Mussolini realistically stated, quote, "We are not dealing with archaeology, but politics," end quote. The entire organism of local self-government has been abolished. The social organization of fascism is a recognition of class distinctions and class conflicts with compulsory adjustments to secure, quote unquote, class cooperation, end quote. Fascism, as distinguished from socialism, preserves private property and enterprise as implements of bureaucracy. The present economic organization of fascism is based on the quote unquote corporate state, end quote. The necessity for which is stated to be economic planning, end quote. The Italian word corporazione, currently translated as corporation, is misleading, as its import is not our business corporation. It is more nearly that of the Old English, quote unquote, guild. Modern expression, which again in American terms is not quite precise, the system is based upon the creation separately of fascist or labor unions and fascist trade associations in each industry or calling, whose authority through committees and administrators is binding upon all those engaged in that industry or calling, even though the actual membership of the association be as small as 10%. These associations or code authorities are juridical persons and have rights not only over their members, but over all those who are in the categories which they cover. All officers are selected from fascists. The plan is cooperative to the extent that coercion, to the extent that coercion from the top produces voluntary, end quote, action. The free labor unions and fraternal associations have been suppressed, and the right to strike and to lock out has been replaced by compulsory determination by labor courts. These associations are directed and regulated by the appointed Minister of Corporations, with an advisory and coordinating body called the National Council of Corporations, comprising some representatives of the associations as well as of the state. The associations have authority to enforce regulations or codes which have been approved by the premier or minister as to the quotas of productions, the use of capital, expansion of plant, of wages, and conditions of labor, of prices, and of distributions, and they are enforced upon all those engaged in these callings or industries through fines, imprisonment, or deprivation of the right to do business. This applies as well to what the farmer may plant, as to what the factory may produce, and to what the product of either can be disposed of. Cheers. It says the associations are required to engage in moral and political propaganda as well as economic direction. To use a fascist phrase, they are an, quote, instrument of economic perfection, unquote, for their members. One of the constantly reiterated primary purposes of this whole economic organism is to bring about, quote unquote, national planning, which is frankly interpreted to mean governmental dictation of economic life. To use again a fascist phrase, quote, the National Council disciplines the interest of the categories with a view to national prosperity, end quote. It's bad, 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 bad. The whole openly represents a regimented economy dictated by government through bureaucracy. The Italian leaders, frankly and realistically, state that such is the case and that it is incompatible with and unworkable in a liberal state, because its operation necessitates the sacrifice to the state of fundamental rights of personal liberty. As independent legislative action, investigation, free speech, free press, free assembly, free elections, every form of political life except fascism have all been forbidden and rigorously suppressed by imprisonment and banishment. It is natural to conclude that fascist experience has demonstrated what our deductions must be, that such an organization of society can only be held and administered by the extinction of the agencies of criticism and correction, and by the destruction of personal liberties through suppression and terrorization. It may be observed that despite the fact that the dictatorship, with the philosophy of regimentation and of national planning, has been in action for over 10 years, it has not been able to ward off the same forces of economic disorganization as we have had to meet in the United States. It says, from 1929 to 1933 in Italy, wholesale prices, agricultural prices, exports and imports, and real wages have been almost identical in their proportional decline with those of the United States. Likewise, unemployment has been a great and increasing burden upon the people. Having dictatorial powers, the Italian government's summarily suppressed the circulation of alarming statements, which might cause runs upon banks. And to that extent, it avoided some of our difficulties. But large measures of support to the financial system were required. The banks were compelled to support the stock market, and government credit was furnished to them for the purpose. In the acute period of 1931 and again in 1933, the banks, becoming overloaded with securities, had to be relieved by governmental action, and a series of new and supplemental credit agencies had to be created by the government to prevent financial collapse. In reckoning what are the values and necessities of this system to Italy in preference to liberalism, we must recognize that the concept of liberty had never been strongly developed in the Italian people. The extent of poverty, class stratification, illiteracy, sectionalism, the tradition of the imperial Roman state with its autocratic principle, the comparative recency of its liberal tradition had prevented much of the penetrative value of liberalism. The standards of living, the diffusion of wealth, the development of welfare activities for the people as a whole, and restraints upon industrial oppression were far behind those of the United States. Apparently, the economic condition of many of the people of Italy has been improved. It must be borne in mind, however, that they started from a level below and still remain far below American standards. Moreover, after the war, the difficulties of the Italian state were greatly increased by socialism and communism and the failure of any party unity. But as to whether the quote unquote emergency was as great as represented, we have only the protagonist view, and necessarily the rise of most dictatorship in history has justified itself upon saving the country in quote unquote emergency, like Justin Trudeau. Whether the Italian state would have equally overcome its difficulties had it renounced socialism and communism and continued under liberal forms, or whether in the high view it has not lost more through sacrifice of freedom than it has gained from regimented economic life, is not the purpose of this inquiry. What we are interested in is whether fascism is better for us. And in this, we know of it mostly through its proponents because of the suppression of criticism from within and of free investigation from without. Even upon this evidence, there is not nor ever has been the remotest social, economic, governmental reason for our adopting it or entering upon a slide toward it, for that accelerates with every step. Fascism is the flat contradiction of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the liberal insistence that progress moves in freedom with the help of doubt and criticism. It means the destruction of self-government and of all checks upon incompetent or ruthless tyranny. Americans unfamiliar with Italy today do not know how safe a thing liberty is, both for our soul and body. Amen. Amen. That's good information. All right, Nazism. Y'all ready for some Nazism? Give me a shout. It says, let me take a sip. The rise of Chancellor Hitler. Oh, let's read about Hitler. Let's read the 1934 version account of Hitler. The rise of Chancellor Hitler and the National Socialist Party, Mark, as did fascism in Italy, the revolt of the middle class. In Germany, the impulses sprang from resentment at the terms of the treaties, the miseries of war and inflation, the detestation of financial exploitation, which arose particularly out of inflation, and from socialism and communism. Despite its name, Hitler's party is violently anti-socialistic. It is not only extremely nationalistic, but extends its vision beyond national borders to extreme racialism, from which arises the inhumane persecution of the Jews. Hitler rose to power by constitutional steps, but within 60 days of Reichstag, upon demand, voted practically unlimited power to the chancellor and, in effect, abandoned all legislative responsibility. Most of the processes have followed the fascist pattern: the unlimited dictatorship, the terrorization, the suppression of all local self-government, the emphasis on class differentiation, the forcible abolition of the craft labor unions, the national planning, the regimented economic life, the practical adoption of the system of the quote-unquote corporate state, the suppression of free speech, free press, and free assembly, the abolition of all guarantees of personal liberty under the Constitution of the Republic. That's right. And here's the last paragraph of this chapter. It says, it may be emphasized again that all of these systems of society, socialism, communism, fascism, and Nazism, have some features in common. All these various forms of the collectivist philosophy merely differ in degree and kinds of servitudes. The daily demonstrations in practice in Italy, Germany, Russia, and elsewhere are proof enough that regimentation of men cannot maintain itself against the will of men to be free except by drastic repression and tyranny. An excellent chapter and an excellent finish of that chapter. So that chapter, I believe, was called Alternative Philosophies. Right? Let's see what chapter that was. Yeah, that was chapter 5, Alternative Philosophies. And now we move into chapter 6, called National Regimentation. National Regimentation. All right. It says the origins, character, and affinities of the regimentation theory of economics and government, its impacts are upon true American liberalism, and its departures from it can be best determined by an examination of the actions taken and measures adopted in the United States during recent months. It is not from oratory, either in advocacy of this philosophy or equally in denial of it, that we must search for its significance. That is to be found by an examination of the actual steps taken and proposed. It says, from this examination, we may dismiss measures of relief of distress from depression and reform of our laws regulating business when such actions conform to the domain of true liberty. For these are, as I shall indicate, not regimentation. The first step of economic regimentation is a vast centralization of power in the executive. Without tedious recitation of the acts of the Congress delegating powers over the people to the executive or his assistants, and omitting relief and regulatory acts, the powers which have been assumed include directly or indirectly the following. It says to debase the coin and set its value, to inflate the currency, to buy and sell gold and silver, to buy government bonds, other securities, and foreign exchange, to seize private stocks of gold at a price fixed by the government, in effect giving to the executive the power to, quote unquote, manage the currency. To levy sales taxes on food, clothing, and upon goods competitive to them, in parentheses, the processing tax, at such times and in such amounts as the executive may determine. To expend enormous sums from the appropriations from public works, relief, and agriculture upon projects not announced to the Congress at the time appropriations were made. To create corporations for a wide variety of business activities, heretofore the exclusive field of private enterprise. To install services and to manufacture commodities in competition with citizens. To buy and sell commodities, to fix minimum prices for industries or dealers, to fix handling charges and therefore profits, to eliminate quote unquote unfair trade practices. To allot the amount of production to individual farms and factories and the character of goods they shall produce, to destroy commodities, to fix stocks of commodities to be on hand, to stop expansion or development of industries or of specific plant and equipment, to establish minimum wages, to fix maximum hours and conditions of labor, to impose collective bargaining, to organize administrative agencies outside the civil service requirements, to abrogate the effect of the antitrust acts, to raise and lower the tariffs, and to discriminate between nations and their application, to abrogate certain governmental contracts without compensation or review by the courts, to enforce most of these powers where they affect the individual by fine and imprisonment through prosecution in the courts, with a further reserved authority in many trades through license to deprive men or their business and livelihood without any appeal to the courts. Most of these powers may be delegated by the executive to any appointee, and the appointees are mostly without the usual confirmation by the Senate. The staffs of most of the new organizations are not selected by the merit requirements of the civil service. These direct or indirect powers were practically all of them delegated by the Congress to the executive upon the representation that they were, quote, emergency, end quote, authorities. And most of them are limited to a specific time for the purpose of bringing about national recovery from the Depression. At some time or place, all of these authorities already have been used. Powers once delegated are bound to be used, for one step drives to another. Moreover, some group somewhere gains benefits or privilege by the use of every power. Once a power is granted, therefore, groups begin to exert the pressure necessary to force its use. Once used, a vested interest is created, which thereafter opposes any relaxation and thereby makes for permanence. But beyond this, many steps once taken set economic forces in motions which cannot be retrieved. Already, we have witnessed all these processes in action. Yep. The manner of use of these powers and their immediate impacts upon the concepts of true American liberty may first be examined under the five groups or ideas into which they naturally fall: regimented industry and commerce, regimented agriculture, government and competitive business, managed currency and credit, and managed foreign trade. Sounds horrible. Regimented industry and commerce. The application of regimentation to business has made great strides. We now have the important branches of industry and commerce organized into trade groups, each presided over by a committee of part trade and part governmental representatives heading up through an quote unquote administrator to the executive. There are a number of advisory boards for various purposes whose personnel is part trade and part bureaucratic. More than 400 separate trades have been so organized, estimated to cover 1.5 million establishments, or about 90% of the business of the country outside of farming. In this organization of commerce and in the industry, the trades were called upon to propose codes of management for their special callings. Parts of each of these codes are, however, imposed by law, whether the trades propose them or not. The determination as to who represents the trade is reserved to the executive, and in the absence of a satisfactory proposal, he may himself make and promulgate a code. He may force deletion of any proposed provision and may similarly impose provisions and exceptions. Each of the codes is directly or indirectly binding upon every member of the trade, whether he was represented in its making or whether he agreed or not. It has the force of statutory law enforced by fine and jail through the courts. Originally, the executive could require every member of a trade to take out a license to do business. In this license, he could impose the conditions under which persons may continue to do business. The executive could revoke a license without affording any appeal to or protection of the courts. The licensing power has expired in general industry, but still stands as an authority to the Secretary of Agriculture over all producers, processors, and dealers in agricultural products. That is a very considerable part of American business. Except as an example of the extent of violation of freedom, this licensing provision is not important, as the other provisions and methods are sufficiently coercive without it. The codes impose minimum wages and maximum hours and provide further for collective agreement with labor as to wages and conditions of work beyond the minimums. By far, the major use of the codes is, however, devoted to the elimination of, quote, unfair competitive practices, unquote. This expression or its counterpart, quote, fair competition, has been interpreted not alone to cover unethical practices, but to include the forced elimination of much normal functioning of competition through reduced production, the prevention of plant expansion, and a score of devices for fixing of minimum prices and trade margins. From its so innocent terms as, quote, fair competition, end quote, and its counterpart have been builded this gigantic dictation, itself a profound example of the growth of power when once granted. In this mobilization, there has been constant use of the term cooperation. However, the law itself makes important parts of the codes compulsory, and by their indirect powers can impose any of them. As practical persons observing their working, we may dismiss voluntary impulses as the motivation of this organization. At best, it is coercive or coercive cooperation. Haha, funny, LOL. Free will and consent, the essential elements in cooperation, have not often been present. That's right. The spirit of the whole process has been coercive, principally through the overshadowing authority to impose the codes and the terror of effective deprival to any man of his business and his livelihood. Bastards. The mere fact of charges made by bureaucrats can act to deprive him of his reputation. Where such authority arises among free men is difficult to discern. Ample evidence of coercion is found in the bludgeoning proceedings of many important code conferences, in the changes forced in some codes. Modern day book of Leviticus. Oh, I think it's more interesting than that, but anyway, from which there was no appeal or refuge. That's just talking about people basically extorting power from others, and making humanity slaves. It's pretty much what they're trying to do. Bureaucracy, bureaucracy. Oh, forced government. Let us rule you. Let us feed you, rule you. Blah, blah, blah. Get out of here. From which there was no appeal or refuge in the incitement to public boycott and in the contracts required in all dealings with the government itself. One need but read the vast flood of propaganda, of threat and pressure, the daily statements of the administering officials, and follow the actions of compliance boards and other agencies in every town or village to confirm the fact of coercion. Men have been fined or ordered to jail for the crime of selling goods or services at lower prices than their competitors. One of the sad results is the arraying of neighbor against neighbor, group against group, all grasping for desperate advantage from the law. So the law, so that, it's like the government needs to just butt out. Y'all need to be minimal. Don't try to act like you are God, because you're not. You don't deserve everything. You really have little say in anything. And just mind your own business. And we should believe in small government, not big government. The bigger you make government, the more of a beast it does. All these people get paid buku for not producing any results. Big government sucks. There are quote unquote unfair practices. See, that's what they want to do. So he defines liberalism. Liberalism was defined different in 1934. Okay. But when you start talking about socialism and fascism, it's like, oh, it's a government takeover. Okay. As we currently have everyone's shouting Ukraine. Let's take over Ukraine. However, the United States is funding the Russians to fight through purchasing oil from them. So here we are, March 3rd, 2022. We are funding the war against Ukraine while crying on behalf of Ukraine. Oh, we love Ukraine. We're standing with Ukraine, 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 when really we are funding the Russians by buying oil from them when we have all the oil we need in America. So this, once again, just shows you the stupidity of stupidity or the genius as they try to take over America, take over the world governmentally. So they're acting like we're helping and standing with the humanity of Ukraine when really we're funding the enemy, quote unquote, the enemy, which is Russia, through buying all their oil. It's just absolutely just, where's the wall? I can just bang my head against the wall. So yeah, keep the government and all social media and potentially propaganda to have you support Ukraine. Yeah, I'm all about the humanity of Ukraine. The humanity of Ukraine, but the government of Ukraine is garbage, and we know they were in bed with the Biden family. So of course, Biden wants Ukraine to get destroyed because there's all evidence there. Let Ukraine get destroyed. He's going to act like they're on Ukraine's side. Oh, a little bit of sanctions, but they're still buying all the oil from Russia, and with that money, they're using that money to destroy Ukraine. So there you have it. Big power grab under the falsehood of, oh, we love the humanity of Ukraine. We all, at the State of the Union address, they all have their Ukraine flags on while they're funding the destruction of them. Yeah. There you go. All right. So one need but read the vast flood of propaganda of threat and pressure, daily statements of the administering officials, and follow the actions of the compliance boards and other agencies in every town or village to confirm the fact of coercion. Men have been fined or ordered to jail for the crime of selling goods or services at lower prices than their competitors. One of the sad results is the arraying of neighbors against neighbor, group against group, all grasping for desperate advantage from the law. These are, quote, unfair practices, end quote, which need to reform because of the failure of some states to rise fully to their responsibilities. The codes have served admirably to reduce child labor by about 25%, and they have eliminated sweating in certain trades. They have eliminated some unethical business practices, but they have stimulated many more new ones through chiseling. This sort of reform is within the powers of the state, and laws to this purpose have been enacted by most of them. If we have determined that we must nationally force these measures on delinquent states, and if they be within the constitutional powers of the federal government, then they can be carried out by specific law enforced by the judicial arm and do not require the regimentation of the economic system. Boom. But in practical working, only a small part of the codes are devoted to these ends. The most effective part of code operations are devoted to limitation of real competition. That's right. Facts on facts. It is true that the law provided that there should be no monopolies or monopolistic practices. The major aspiration of those seeking to avoid the antitrust acts always have been precisely the fixing of minimum prices and restriction of output. And these objectives, so earnestly yearned for in some quarters, now have been imposed by law. The economic results, so far as the trades and consumers are concerned, are about the same as if the antitrust acts had been abolished. Naturally, if these industrial regiments hold to discipline, they are at once constituted as complete guild monopolies as any in the Elizabethan period, from which we derived much of our American antagonism to monopoly. Yeah. But let's see, we got two more paragraphs here. This is, but an equally regrettable social effect has been that the imposition of larger cost and the fixing of minimum prices and trade differentials crashes down at once on smaller units of business. If persisted in, there can be no destiny of these processes in the long run, but a gradual absorption of business by the larger units, Walmart and Dollar General. All this is, in fact, the greatest legal mechanism ever devised for squeezing the smaller competitor out of action easily and by the majesty of the law. Yet the small business is the very fiber of our community life. Facts. Over it all is now the daily dictation by government in every town and village every day in the week of how men are to conduct their daily lives under constant threat of jail for crimes which have no moral turpitude. All this is the most stupendous invasion of the whole spirit of liberty that the nation has witnessed since the days of colonial America. Yeah. Regimented agriculture. Regimented agriculture is the next section. That's just a couple pages, and then it'll be government in competitive business. That's right. Let's get that competitive business. All right, you guys ready? It says regimented agriculture. The farmer is the farmer is the most tragic figure in our present situation. From the collapse of war, inflation, from boom, from displacement of work animals by mechanization, from the breakdown of foreign markets, from the financial debacle of Europe, and from drought, he has suffered almost beyond human endurance. Mom and Pop are gone. You're right, Brother P. Tracy. That's what's going on. Instead of temporarily reducing the production of marginal lands by measures of relief pending world recovery, the great majority of farmers were regimented to reduce production from the fertile lands. The idea of a subsidy to a farmer to reduce his production in a particular, quote, staple commodity, end quote, was expanded by requiring a contract that he would follow orders from the Secretary of Agriculture in the production of other, quote unquote, staple commodities, end quote. Voluntary action was further submerged by threats that if he did not sign up, he would have difficulty in obtaining credit. What's up, Brother Joe? Brother Joe, greetings to you. Reading a book from 1934 called The Challenge to Liberty. the challenge to liberty. It says the whole process has been a profound example both of how bureaucracy, once given powers to invade liberty, proceeds to fatten and enlarge its activities, and of how departures from practical human nature and economic experience soon find themselves so entangled as to force more and more violent steps. To escape the embarrassment of the failure to reduce production by these methods, still further steps were taken into coercion and regimentation. Yet more quote unquote staples not authorized by the Congress to be controlled when the contracts were signed were added to the list. A further step was to use the taxing power on excess production of cotton and to set quotas on sugar. Directly or indirectly, on many farms, these devices create a privilege and destroy a right. Since only those who have had the habit of producing cotton and some other commodities may now do so. They are given a monopoly, and any other farmer is precluded from turning his land to that purpose. And recently, still further powers were demanded from the Congress by which the last details of complete coercion and dictation might be exerted not alone to farmers, but to everyone who manufactures and distributes farm products. That all this is marching to full regimentation of 30 millions of our agricultural population is obvious enough. But we are told that the farmer must, in the future, sacrifice liberty to economic comfort. The economic comfort up to date may be questioned, as likewise the longevity of any comfort, for the basic premise is not tenable. Thomas Jefferson once said, quote, "We were directed from Washington when to sow and when to reap. We should soon want bread." It's funny. The stark fact is that if part of liberty to a particular farmer is removed, the program must move quickly into complete dictation, for there are here no intermediate stages. The nature of agriculture makes it impossible to have regimentation up to a point and freedom of action beyond that point. Either the farmer must use his own judgment, must be free to plant and sell as he wills, or he must take orders from the corporal put above him. The whole thesis behind this program is the very theory that man is but the pawn of the state. It is a usurpation of the primary liberties of men by government. This is correct. Government and competitive business. Let's go. Let's get that competitive business going. It says the deliberate entry of the government into business in competition with the citizen, or in replacement of private enterprise, in parentheses, other than as a minor incident to some major public purpose, close parentheses, is regimentation of the people directly into a bureaucracy. That, of course, is socialism in the connotation of any socialist or economist, and is confirmed as such today by the acclaim of the socialists. As an instance, we may cite the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the major purpose of the government is the purchase, construction, operation, transmission, and sale of electricity in the Tennessee Valley and neighborhood. Together with the manufacture and merchandising of appliances, fertilizers, chemicals, and other commodities. Other instances occur where public works money has been allotted to the erection of dams and reservoirs, and to the construction of power plants, the major purpose of which is to undertake the production and sale of electricity in competition with the citizen. There have long been instances of public works for the real major purpose of flood control, irrigation, or navigation, which produce water power as a byproduct. Here, if the government leases this power under proper protections to the public, the competition with the citizen is avoided. Here is one of the definite boundaries between liberty and socialism. Under liberty, the citizen must have strong regulation of the rates and profits of power companies to protect him from oppression by the operator of a natural monopoly. But where the government deliberately enters into business as a major purpose in competition with the citizen, that is socialism. That's right. Still other instances. Let's see, Instagram's almost over. Instagram, I'll holler back later. Boom, 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 and boom, and boom, and boom. There we go. There have long been instances of public works for the real major purpose of flood control, irrigation, or navigation. Okay, we did that. Still, other instances of government competition with citizens are 5 corporations created by the government under the laws of Delaware, which are engaged in various competitive businesses covering the manufacture and merchandising of commodities. Those entries into socialism were not an important emergency call to relieve unemployment. The total expenditures provided will employ but a very small percentage of the unemployed. In fact, the threat to private enterprise will probably stifle employment of more men in the damage to existing enterprises. There is already an ample private capacity to supply any of the commodities they produce, whether electricity, fertilizers, rum, or furniture. Whatever their output is, its production will displace that much private employment somewhere. We have only to examine a fragment of the statements of their sponsors to find that their purposes, although sometimes offered as employment, are in fact further blows pounding in the wedge of socialism as a part of regimenting the people into a bureaucracy. There are measures in this last paragraph of the section says there are measures in banking and credit which might be discussed under the heading, but they are dealt with elsewhere. And in another chapter of this book, I've dealt at length with the effect and destiny of socialism. The next section is manage currency and credit. The scope of this survey does not include a full examination of monetary, fiscal, and credit policies. I am here concerned solely with profound departures from liberty. Without entering upon the recent technical monetary steps taken, it may be said at once that the intent of the powers given to alter the unit value of currency is by, quote, manage currency, end quote, to enable the government to change from time to time the purchasing power of the currency for all commodities, wages, salaries, and income. One underlying intent of the monetary measures was the transfer of income and property from one individual to another or from one group to another upon an enormous scale without judicial processes. Whether the theory under this assumption will produce the effects intended or not, the intent is definitely expressed. The installation of managed currency required the repudiation of the government contract to meet its obligations in gold, and the repudiation of the gold clause extended much farther than repudiation of government obligations alone, for it changed the value of all contracts between citizens far beyond the present appreciation of the citizen of its possible results, if it shall prove to have the effect which was intended. One of the major objectives stated was to reduce unbearable debt. It was asserted that the value of the dollar, as represented in its purchasing power for goods or services, had changed from its value when the original bargains of debt were made. Under this operation, the citizens were regimented into 2 groups, debtors and creditors. An empirical and universal amount of 40 to 50% was set as the degree of shift in the value of all property to the debtor regiment from the creditor regiment. Let me read this little thing here. It says a little sub note. It says, why are we going off the gold standard? Question mark. With nearly 40% of the entire gold supplies of the world, why are we going off the gold standard? With all the earmarked gold, with all the securities of ours that they hold, foreign governments could withdraw in total less than 700 million of our gold, which would leave us an ample fund of gold in the extremest case to maintain gold payments both abroad and at home. Quote, to me, the suggestion that we may devalue the gold dollar 50% means national repudiation. To me, it means dishonor. in my conception of it, it is immoral. Quote, all the legalistic arguments which the lawyers of the Senate, men of eminent ability and refinement, may make here, or have made here, have not dislodged from my mind the irrevocable conviction that it is immoral, and that it means not only a contravention of my party's platform in that respect, but of the promises of party spokesmen during the campaign. Quote, Mr. President, there was never any necessity for a gold embargo. There is no there is no necessity for making statutory criminals of citizens of the United States who may please to take property in the shape of gold or currency out of banks and use it for their own purposes as they may please. Quote, if there were no need to go off the gold standard, very well, I would say let us go off the gold standard, but there has been no need for that. This was from the Senate remarks of Mr. Glass, senator from Virginia, April 27th, 1933. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, the repudiation of the gold clause extended much farther than repudiation of the government obligations alone, for it changed the value of all contracts between citizens far beyond the present appreciation of the citizens of its possible results, if it shall prove to have the effect which was intended. One of the major objectives stated was to reduce unbearable debt. It was asserted that the value of the dollar as represented in its purchasing power for goods or services had changed from its value when the original bargains of debt were made. Under this operation, the citizens were regimented into two groups, debtors and creditors. An empirical and universal amount of 40 to 50% was set as the degree of shift in the value of all property to the debtor regiment from the creditor regiment. This act involved the widest responsibility which the government bears to its citizens and that individuals bear toward each other. For fidelity to contract unless determined unconscionable by an independent tribunal is the very integrity of liberty and of economic society, where the debt of certain groups, such as part of the farmers and homeowners, becomes oppressive, and its social results to the entire nation are of vital importance. Excuse me. Such a service is justified, but it should not have been undertaken at the particular cost of those honest creditors whose savings have been thus invested, but should have been a special burden upon the whole nation. But the injustice is far wider than this. These monetary acts extend the assumption of unbearable debt over the whole of the private and public debts of the nation. That this attempt at universal shift of 40 to 50% of the value of all debts was neither necessary nor just can be demonstrated in a few sentences. The theory mistakenly assumed that the distorted prices and values at the depth of a banking panic were permanent. It assumed that the recovery from depression in progress through the world would not extend to the United States. Of even more importance, this theory also assumed that every single debt had become oppressive, that every single creditor had benefited by about one half since the initial bargain, that every single debtor had lost by this amount, that no debtor could carry out his initial bargain, and that the respective rights of every debtor and every creditor in every kind of property should be shifted from debtor to creditor without any inquiry or process of justice. Debt is an individual thing, not a mass transaction. The circumstance of every debt vary. Certainly, the government cannot contend that its debt was oppressive. No man has yet stated that the government could not have paid its obligations in full. It was not insolvent. It was not bankrupt. In large areas of private debt, the borrower was amply able to meet his obligations. In other great areas, he had already profited by large dividends of or earnings. or otherwise by the use of the savings of lenders which he had deliberately solicited. A huge part of the bond issues of railways, of power companies, of industrial companies, of foreign governments, current commercial debt, the bank deposits, urban mortgages, and whatnot belong to these categories. The evidence of the volume of debts which require governmental relief as a social necessity does not, by any conceivable calculation, indicate more than a very minor percentage of the total public and private debt. Extensive provisions for the adjustment between individuals of their debts were made by new facilities under the bankruptcy acts and the further relief measures provided through the use of government credit. But let us examine the injustice under this managed currency more particularly. In a great category where debt required adjustment, there had already been many compromises between debtors and investors, as witness the many reorganizations of urban building loans and corporate and other obligations, which were the products of inflation. The people's savings invested in these cases are required by depreciation of the dollar to submit to a still further loss. Most lending is ultimately from savings, which means somebody's self denial of the joy of spending today in order to provide for the future. But the borrower is often enough a person who secured these joys and is now to be relieved of part payment. Although a larger part of these borrowers are able to pay, the man who borrowed from an insurance company to build himself a more expensive and enjoyable house has secured these joys at the cost of the policyholder, who had hoped by self denial to escape dependency. This applies equally to huge debt of industrial and commercial businesses, which profited by their borrowings from the policyholder and the depositor in a savings bank. Those self denying investors, the thrifty of the nation, who were willing to accept a low rate of interest in order to obtain the maximum security, are under this theory to have the purchasing value of their savings now shrunken in exactly the same ratio as the avaricious who received extortionate rates, or the reckless who took high risk. The holders of hard-won savings, the widow's mite, invested in 3.25% first mortgage industrial bonds, are called upon to sacrifice the same proportion as the holders of 7% third mortgages by the transfer of values from the first mortgage bondholder to the common stockholder. The security of these speculative bonds is even increased. At once, we see the evidence of this in the marked advance in the prices of these speculative debts. This disregard of prudence and this benefit to recklessness particularly penalizes a very large part of insurance and the great public endowment assets. 10 billions of endowments is educational, hospitalization, and welfare activities. Creditors whose debtors are mostly corporations and governments are to be depleted in purchasing power. These endowed institutions give the leadership necessary to all our vast complex of public institutions. Yet, if this theory eventuate, their activities must diminish by 40%. Furthermore, if this theory shall succeed, the great bulk of industrial debt, the empirical reduction of purchasing power of the regiments of bondholders, transfers this purchasing power to the regiments of common stockholders. Any inspection of who are the rank and file in these regiments will at once demonstrate the double injustice. The holders of bonds are largely the insurance company, the savings bank depositor, the small investor, and the endowed institution. If this intent of devaluation shall eventuate, the transfer of property by government fiat from 60 million insurance policy holders to 10 million stockholders is not even diffusion of wealth. Is not even diffusion of wealth. It is further a concentration of wealth. As a matter of fact, any survey of the total results would show, in parentheses, if the theory of these acts works out, close parentheses, that it will benefit the richest members of the community because their property is, in the main, in equities. the hardship will fall upon the great mass of the people who are indirect holders of obligations through their savings in insurance and saving bank deposits, as well as those who directly hold bonds and mortgages. That is, in our modern American economy, the rich are more largely holders of equities, and those of moderate means more largely the holders of obligations. Thus, the rich hereby become richer, the poor poorer. Monetary shifts in their very nature are mostly irretrievable. There can be little turning back. All right, we're at page 98. In the portion of national regimentation. Then we'll go to managed foreign trade under national regimentation, and that would be the end of the chapter. All right, so we have a few more pages to the end of the chapter. I would do. Oh, there's no top on that, so I'll just spray that all over the wall. Whoopsie daisies. Send that book to DC with highlighted sections. Yeah, I should have had the highlighter out. Definitely should have had the highlighter out. You know, some people don't like writing books, but I mean, there's certain things that need to be said, you know. So there's pretty much no reason why I should not be highlighting. You're right. You're right, Brother Pete. I should have been highlighting. Whoopsie days. Well, let me go ahead and close right there. I'm going to stick my 3x5 card. Last time I read was February 15th. Now it is March 3rd. March 3rd. Finished page 97. And so, yeah, we did page 55. Page 55 to 97. Okay, cool. All right, good. So I'm going to put that right there. I'll pick up later on, do a few other things. Thanks for riding out with me, Brother Pete. Appreciate that. We'll close down YouTube. Thank you, YouTube, for hopping on. There we go, YouTube.